When my grandfather passed away, the family gathered in the old house he had lived in for more than 50 years, a house that carried the smell of wood, books, and memories. He had been a strong figure in all our lives, someone who made sure Sunday dinners were a tradition and that every one of his grandchildren felt important, but when he died, it became clear that his absence left more than just emotional emptiness. His will was supposed to determine what he left behind, and most of us believed the process would be straightforward, since he was always a man who valued fairness. I had grown up close to him, especially after my father passed away when I was young, so he often told me stories about how everything he built would one day be passed to those who truly valued it. I never pushed him for details, but I knew he wanted me to feel secure, and I trusted that his word meant something. What none of us expected, however, was how quickly family bonds could unravel when money and property entered the conversation, and how someone you think you can trust could be the very person working behind the scenes to take what wasn't meant for them. At the heart of this story is my Aunt Margaret, a woman who always carried herself with elegance, who wore pearls at breakfast and corrected everyone's grammar as if she were the headmistress of the family. People described her as proper and organized, but those of us who knew her well recognized a different side, sharp, controlling, and often manipulative in subtle ways that didn't immediately seem harmful. Growing up, I avoided conflict with her, partly because my mother told me it wasn't worth the energy, and partly because Margaret could make anyone feel small without raising her voice. When the lawyer announced that the reading of the will would take place 2 weeks after the funeral, I noticed Margaret's smile lingered a little too long, like she already knew something the rest of us didn't. My cousin Daniel leaned over to me and whispered, "She looks like a cat who caught the mouse," and I tried to laugh it off, but the unease was already settling in. The days leading up to the will reading felt heavy. My mother kept saying she wasn't worried, because her father had always been straightforward, but I saw how she double-checked old documents and even went to the attic to look for letters he had written in the past, as if she wanted to reassure herself of his intentions. I didn't tell her, but I was nervous too, not because I expected anything extravagant, but because my grandfather once told me that the house held more than just furniture and old photographs. He hinted that certain things inside it were meant to protect the family's future, and his tone was so serious that I never forgot it. Finally, the day arrived. We gathered in the lawyer's office, a dim room with dark wooden shelves lined with books that looked as though no one had touched them in decades. The lawyer, Mr. Carver, was a calm man in his 60s who spoke without rushing, his voice carrying the weight of routine. He began by going through formalities, explaining debts, minor assets, and smaller distributions. Margaret sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face unmoving, but I caught her tapping her foot, a tiny crack in her polished demeanor. Then came the part everyone had been waiting for, the house. My grandfather's home wasn't just property, it was valuable land, worth more than most of us had imagined, especially after the area had been developed in recent years. Mr. Carver looked up at us before reading, and for a second, I thought I saw hesitation, like he understood the words were about to light a fuse none of us could put out. He cleared his throat and said that the house, along with its contents, was to go to me. The words seemed to echo in the room. My mother looked relieved, Daniel looked impressed, and even the lawyer seemed to expect the reactions, but Margaret, her lips pressed so tightly they turned white, and for the first time in my life, I saw her lose that carefully crafted composure. She didn't object in front of everyone, of course. Margaret never created public scenes, but I knew in that moment that her silence was not agreement, it was calculation. The meeting ended, papers were signed, and I walked out into the sunlight thinking everything was finally clear. But later that night, when I drove by the house just to sit outside and let it sink in, I noticed something strange. The upstairs light was on, even though no one was supposed to be there. At first, I thought maybe the lawyer or my mother had gone in, but when I got closer, I saw a figure through the window, moving quickly from one room to another. My heart raced as I sat in my car, staring at the silhouette, and though I couldn't make out the face, I knew. It was Margaret. And whatever she was doing inside the house that was now legally mine, it wasn't by accident. I sat frozen in the car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned pale, my mind racing with reasons why Margaret would be inside the house when she had no right to be there. At first, I wanted to believe she had some harmless explanation, maybe she had forgotten something after helping with the funeral, but the rational part of me reminded myself that she was meticulous, she never forgot details, and more importantly, she wasn't allowed to step inside anymore. Still, I couldn't bring myself to confront her that night, partly out of fear of what I might discover, and partly because I wanted proof before accusing her of anything. The next morning, I returned with a spare key that Mr. Carver had given me, determined to look around. At first, nothing seemed out of place, the old wooden furniture, the bookshelves, the photographs in their frames, but when I walked upstairs, the feeling in the house shifted. My grandfather's study door, which had always been locked when he was alive, stood slightly ajar. I remembered how he once told me, "What's in there will make sense when the time comes," and though I had never entered before, I now stepped inside cautiously. The room was neat, as though preserved in time, but the desk drawers were disturbed, papers scattered in a way that suggested someone had been searching. It wasn't chaotic, just subtle enough to look like normal clutter, but I knew my grandfather's habits, and he was never careless with his things. I found a folder tucked under a stack of books, half hidden, its corner sticking out just enough to catch my eye. Inside were documents with his handwriting, notes about property deeds, accounts, and something labeled "Trust for Clara." That was my mother's name. My hands trembled as I scanned the pages, realizing my grandfather had set aside additional assets, separate from what was mentioned in the will, but before I could understand the full scope, I heard the creak of the front door. My body stiffened. Someone was in the house again. I quickly slipped the folder back where I found it and stood silently, listening. Footsteps echoed down the hall, slow, deliberate, as though the person knew the house well. When the sound reached the stairs, I quietly shut the study door and waited. The steps passed by, heading toward the kitchen, and I used that moment to leave through the back, my heart pounding. I didn't see her face, but I didn't need to. The sound of her heels against the wooden floor was unmistakable, Margaret. I drove straight to my mother's place and told her everything, but instead of the outrage I expected, she sighed heavily, almost as though she had been waiting for this moment. She sat me down and said, "Your aunt has always believed she was entitled to more than anyone else. Your grandfather and I used to argue about it. He tried to set things straight in the will, but Margaret, she knows how to twist the system." When I pressed her for details, she shook her head, unwilling, or maybe afraid to say more. "Just be careful," she warned, "because once she feels cornered, she doesn't stop." Those words echoed in my mind as I thought about the folder I had found, about the fact that Margaret had been there not once but twice already, searching for something she believed belonged to her. It wasn't just about the house, it was about something hidden inside it, something worth risking everything for. The following week, I began going through the house systematically, checking every drawer, every shelf, and even the attic, searching for what my grandfather might have left behind. Some rooms felt untouched, but others carried subtle signs of intrusion, a slightly shifted carpet, a drawer closed unevenly, dust patterns disturbed. Margaret had been here more often than I realized. One evening, while searching the attic, I discovered a small locked chest under a pile of blankets. It was heavy, metal, and unlike anything else in the house. My pulse quickened as I lifted it, realizing this could be what she had been after, but the lock was sturdy, and no key was in sight. I brought it downstairs and hid it in my car, determined not to leave it where she might return and find it. That night, Daniel called me unexpectedly. He said, "Look, I don't want to get in the middle of family drama, but I think you should know. Aunt Margaret has been talking to someone at the bank. She told them she's the rightful heir to the property." My stomach dropped. How could she make such a claim when the will was clear? Unless she had something, some paper, some leverage that could override what we already knew. I realized then that whatever was in that chest might be the missing piece, not just for me, but for her too. The next day, I went back to Mr. Carver, explaining what I had found without giving too many details, and he raised his eyebrows, saying, "If your grandfather left anything outside of the will, especially something locked away, it might contain instructions he didn't want to make public. Be cautious who you tell." He offered to help me get the chest open, but I wasn't ready yet, not until I understood more. That evening, as I parked near the house, I noticed a car already sitting in the driveway. Margaret's. She was inside again. My chest tightened with anger, but this time I decided not to run. I unlocked the back door as quietly as I could and stepped in, the air heavy with tension. I followed the sound of movement until I reached the study again. She stood there, back turned to me, rifling through the same desk I had checked days before. For the first time, I spoke up, my voice sharper than I expected, looking for something, Aunt Margaret? She froze, her shoulders stiffening, before slowly turning to face me. Her expression wasn't guilt, it was something far more unsettling. She smiled. Margaret's smile was the kind that didn't reach her eyes, the kind that made you feel as though you were playing a game where she already knew the rules and you didn't. She closed the drawer she had been searching, straightened her posture, and said calmly, "I see you've taken an interest in your grandfather's study. Funny, isn't it, how some people inherit things they don't even understand?" Her words stung, but I refused to let her rattle me. I told her the will was clear and that the house was legally mine, but she just tilted her head, as if amused, and replied, "Paperwork can be challenged. You'd be surprised how often what's written in black and white is not what actually stands." My instinct screamed that she wasn't bluffing, that she was preparing something bigger than just sneaking into the house. I asked her what she was looking for, and instead of denying it, she stepped closer, lowering her voice like she was letting me in on a secret. "Your grandfather wasn't as transparent as you think. He kept things hidden, things that rightfully belonged to me, and I'm not leaving until I find them." There was no shame in her tone, only cold certainty, and for a moment, I doubted myself. Maybe she knew something I didn't, maybe there was more to the story than what the will revealed. Before I could respond, she brushed past me, her perfume lingering in the air, and walked toward the door. "Don't worry," she said over her shoulder, "you'll understand soon enough." And with that, she left, as if she had accomplished exactly what she came for. That night, I couldn't sleep. Her words replayed in my head, colliding with the image of the locked chest I had hidden in my car. What if that was what she was after? What if it contained proof of her claim, or worse, something that could undo my grandfather's intentions? At sunrise, I drove to a locksmith I trusted, someone discreet who wouldn't ask questions, and asked him to open the chest. It took nearly an hour of careful work, and my nerves were on edge the entire time, but finally, with a soft click, the lock gave way. I lifted the lid slowly, half expecting stacks of money or legal papers, but instead I found bundles of letters, neatly tied with string, and a leather-bound notebook. The letters were addressed to my mother, but they were never sent. They were from my grandfather, written over the course of years, explaining his fears about Margaret, his concern that she would manipulate her way into claiming what wasn't hers, and his instructions for keeping certain accounts secure. The notebook contained records of assets I had never heard about before, investments, bonds, even property under different names, all meant for my mother and, eventually, me. My hands shook as I realized the weight of what I was holding. This wasn't just an inheritance, it was my grandfather's way of protecting us from Margaret, his insurance against her schemes. I drove straight to my mother and showed her everything. She read the letters silently, tears brimming in her eyes, and whispered, "I knew he was worried about her, but I didn't realize he went this far." For a brief moment, relief washed over me, but it didn't last. Because if Margaret had been searching the house, she must have known something existed, and now that I had it, she wouldn't stop until she got her hands on it. Days passed with uneasy silence, but then Daniel called me again. He sounded nervous as he said, "She's been talking to a lawyer of her own. She told him there are documents hidden in the house that prove the will is invalid." My stomach twisted. She was close to the truth, maybe closer than I thought, and if she managed to convince someone with enough influence, the whole thing could turn into a battle I wasn't prepared for. That evening, as I returned to the house to double-check every corner, I noticed the front door was slightly open. My pulse spiked. I stepped inside cautiously, calling out, but no one answered. The silence was thick, broken only by the creak of the floor under my feet. I moved room to room until I reached the study again, and there, on the desk, lay a single envelope with my name on it. My throat tightened as I picked it up, recognizing my grandfather's handwriting. But that wasn't the part that terrified me. The envelope hadn't been there before. Someone had placed it on the desk recently. My hand shook as I opened it and read the short message inside. If you found this, it means she is closer than you think. Do not trust her promises. The truth is buried deeper than the house. I stared at the note, confusion and fear swirling together. Buried deeper than the house? What did that mean? My mind jumped to the basement, the one part of the house I had barely touched, a place that always felt colder, darker, almost deliberately avoided by everyone. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down the narrow stairs, the air thick with dust. At first, nothing seemed unusual, just old boxes, tools, and furniture covered in sheets. But then I noticed a section of the floor that looked different, the wood newer than the rest, as though it had been replaced. I knelt down, running my fingers along the edge, and felt a faint gap where the boards didn't quite align. My heart pounded as I realized there was something hidden beneath. Before I could pry it open, a voice came from behind me, calm and chilling. You're finally looking in the right place. I spun around, and there she was, Margaret, standing at the bottom of the stairs, her face half in shadow, her smile sharper than ever. Margaret's voice sent a chill down my spine, and the way she stood there in the basement doorway made it clear she had been watching me long enough to know exactly what I had discovered. I forced myself to stay calm, gripping the flashlight tighter, and asked her how she had even gotten inside. She ignored the question, her eyes fixed on the section of floorboards I had been examining, and said softly, I told you there were things you didn't understand. Your grandfather always thought he could outsmart me, but he underestimated how well I know this house. Her tone wasn't angry, it was steady, almost triumphant, as though she had been waiting for this moment. I asked her what she thought was hidden here, but instead of answering directly, she stepped closer, lowering her voice. It isn't about the house. It's about what he buried from all of us. He was hiding money, accounts, even land that none of you knew about. I know because I found one of his letters years ago, a letter he never meant for me to see. He kept talking about a legacy, about making sure certain people never touched it. That's when I realized, he meant me. My heart pounded as she continued, and now, you've stumbled right on top of it. I knew she was manipulative, but her words carried enough conviction to rattle me. I crouched down and pried at the edge of the boards, my hands shaking, and after a few tries one of the planks lifted with a groan. Beneath it was a shallow compartment, dusty but intact, and inside lay another locked metal box, smaller than the one I had opened earlier. Margaret leaned in with a gleam in her eyes, whispering, That's it. For a moment I considered slamming the plank back down and walking away, but something in me refused to give her the satisfaction. I pulled the box out and set it on the floor between us, my breath quick and uneven. Margaret folded her arms, waiting, clearly confident that I would open it. I asked her why she was so certain it belonged to her, and she laughed softly, a sound that made my stomach twist. Because he promised me once. Before your father died, before all of this, he said I would never be left out. But when he changed the will, he betrayed me. This box, whatever is inside, will prove he meant what he said. I wanted to argue, to call her delusional, but the truth was I didn't know what was inside, and a part of me feared she might not be lying. I told her I wasn't opening it there, not with her watching, and I picked up the box, tucking it under my arm. Her smile faded into something sharper. If you walk out with that, you'll regret it, she warned, her voice low and edged. For a long second we stared at each other, the silence broken only by the sound of an old pipe dripping somewhere in the basement. Then I forced myself to push past her and climb the stairs, leaving her standing in the shadows. That night I couldn't stop thinking about her words, about the possibility that my grandfather had left something contradictory hidden away, something that could be twisted to her advantage. I wanted to open the box immediately, but a part of me hesitated. What if she was right? What if the contents changed everything? I locked it in my closet and tried to sleep, though every creak of the house made me wonder if Margaret was outside, waiting. The next morning I returned to Mr. Carver, setting the box on his desk. He studied it carefully, his brow furrowed, and said, "If this contains what I suspect, it could settle everything, or cause a war in your family. Are you ready for that?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure I truly was. He called a trusted colleague who specialized in estate disputes, and together they managed to pry the lock open without damaging the contents. Inside was not money or deeds as Margaret had believed, but a collection of handwritten documents, some signed and notarized, others personal notes. My grandfather had detailed his fears about Margaret, specifically naming her as someone he worried would manipulate legal systems to claim more than what was hers. He described in clear language why he left the house to me, why he secured other assets for my mother, and how Margaret's sense of entitlement had already caused rifts in the family years earlier. It was undeniable proof that his intentions were deliberate, not accidental. As I flipped through the pages, my relief grew, but then I found something I didn't expect. Tucked in the back of the box was a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, addressed not to me or my mother, but to Margaret herself. I froze, staring at it, my mind racing with questions. Why would he leave her a personal letter if he wanted to keep her away from everything else? Mr. Carver suggested we not open it yet, that perhaps it was meant to be delivered directly, but curiosity gnawed at me. Against his advice, I carefully broke the seal. The letter was short, written in my grandfather's familiar hand. "Margaret," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have searched where you should not. I did not forget you, but I could not reward your actions. What I leave you is not property or money, but the truth of why I chose differently. If you can accept it, perhaps you will find peace. If not, then your anger will consume you, as it always has." My hand shook as I read it aloud, and silence filled the room afterward. It wasn't the treasure she expected, it was a warning, maybe even a final attempt to reach her. But when I thought about how she looked at me in the basement, about the fire in her eyes, I knew peace was the last thing she would accept. Hours passed as I moved boxes, inspected walls, tapped at the wooden beams, and just when I was ready to give up, I noticed something behind the old furnace. A small metal latch, almost invisible against the wall. My pulse quickened as I pulled at it, and to my shock, a narrow panel opened, revealing a hidden compartment in the wall. Inside was a small tin container, rusted and dusty, but intact. My hands shook as I opened it, expecting more letters, but what I found made my blood run cold: birth certificates, old photographs, and documents with names I didn't recognize. At the top of the pile was a birth record with my grandfather listed as the father, and Margaret's name as the mother. My vision blurred as I tried to process what I was looking at. Margaret had a child. A child none of us had ever been told about. And from the dates, it happened decades ago, long before I was born, long before any of this inheritance drama began. The photographs showed a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing in front of the very house I was living in now, smiling, his features bearing an unsettling resemblance to both my grandfather and Margaret. I felt sick. Why had this been hidden? Why had no one in the family ever spoken of it? I shoved everything back into the tin and sealed the panel shut, my heart racing. This was the secret Margaret had been after all along, not just money, not just property, but proof of something that could explain her rage, her bitterness, her endless insistence that she had been cheated. When I left the basement, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a single line: "Now you know." My hand shook as I stared at the screen, dread filling every corner of me. It had to be Margaret. Somehow she knew I had found it. That evening she showed up at the house, uninvited as always, but this time she didn't bother with pretense. She stood in the doorway, her face pale but her eyes blazing, and said, "You went where you shouldn't have. Did you think I wouldn't notice?" I tried to stay calm, asking her directly about the boy in the photographs, about the documents, but instead of answering, she stepped closer and hissed, "He was mine. And your grandfather took him from me." Her words hit like a blow, but before I could respond she turned and walked away into the night, leaving me trembling in the doorway, clutching the secret that suddenly made every piece of this inheritance battle so much darker than I had ever imagined. Her words echoed in my mind long after she disappeared into the night, the revelation that she had once had a child with my grandfather twisting everything I thought I knew about my family. I didn't sleep, I couldn't. I sat at the kitchen table with the tin box in front of me, the photographs spread out like pieces of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. The boy's face stared back at me from decades ago, innocent, unaware of the storm his existence would one day cause. My grandfather, who had always seemed so steadfast and moral, had hidden this from everyone, even from my mother. And Margaret, who had spent her life bitter and grasping, wasn't just motivated by greed, she was motivated by something far more complicated, a sense of betrayal, of being erased. By morning, I knew I couldn't keep the secret to myself. I went straight to my mother and showed her the documents. Her face drained of color as she sifted through the papers, whispering, "No, this can't be." But the evidence was undeniable. She sat in silence for a long time before finally saying, "He must have felt ashamed. Ashamed of what it would do to the family if the truth came out. So he buried it." The weight of it pressed on both of us, and I could see in her eyes the conflict between grief, anger, and disbelief. Before we could process further, there was a knock at the door. It was Margaret. She didn't wait to be invited in, she simply walked into the house with the same commanding presence she always carried. "You've seen it," she said flatly, her eyes darting to the documents on the table. "So now you understand why this inheritance should never have been yours." My mother's voice trembled as she asked, "What happened to him, Margaret? The boy? Where is he now?" For the first time, Margaret's expression faltered. She looked down, her lips tightening, and then she whispered, "He was taken from me. Our father arranged it. He said it was for the best, that it would destroy the family if anyone found out. They sent him away, to relatives in another state. I never saw him again." The room was silent, the weight of her confession suffocating. I asked her if she had ever tried to find him, and her eyes flickered with a bitterness that was deeper than any I had seen before. "Of course I tried," she said sharply. "But every door was shut, every record vanished. And by the time I had the means, it was too late. He was gone. Do you know what it feels like to be erased? To have your own child erased from history? Her voice cracked at the last word, and for a moment I saw not the manipulative, cold aunt I had always known, but a broken woman carrying decades of pain. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but she steadied herself and said, "None of that changes what father wrote. He made his choices, Margaret. He didn't leave the house to you, he didn't leave the assets to you, and you know why? He didn't trust you." Margaret's face hardened again, the vulnerability slipping away like a mask she had briefly dropped. "He didn't trust me because he couldn't control me," she spat. "But I will not let his lies dictate my legacy." She reached for the documents on the table, but I pulled them away before she could touch them. That was when her composure finally cracked. She shouted, her voice shaking the walls, "He was mine. And everything he built should have been his son's. My son's." The fury in her words made the truth hit me like ice. This wasn't just about her. This was about the child she lost, the boy who had grown up somewhere else, who by blood had as much claim to this inheritance as any of us. I told her the truth as firmly as I could. Even if that boy were here today, it still wouldn't erase the will. It still wouldn't erase what grandfather wanted. He left this to us, not you. And if your son ever came forward, I would share everything with him, but not with you. Because you've done nothing but destroy. The silence that followed was heavy, her eyes burning into mine, but she didn't argue. For the first time, she had no words. She turned and walked out of the house, and though I expected her to slam the door behind her, she didn't. She just left quietly, like a shadow retreating. Weeks passed, and though I braced for another attack, it never came. Margaret stopped showing up, stopped calling, stopped fighting. It was as though she had finally accepted that there was nothing left for her to take. But I could never forget what I had learned, never forget that somewhere out there was a man who had no idea he was the son of my grandfather and my aunt. I didn't know if I would ever find him, if I even should, but the thought haunted me every time I walked through the halls of the house that now belonged to me. My grandfather had tried to bury the truth, but the truth had clawed its way back to the surface, demanding to be seen. Margaret had lost her battle, but in a way, we had all lost something too, the image of the man we thought we knew, the simplicity of family ties we thought were unbreakable. And though I kept the house, though the inheritance was secure, I knew it was no longer just a home. It was a reminder. A reminder of the secrets people bury, of the lengths they'll go to protect them, and of the damage those secrets leave behind when they finally come to light.